The footage you're watching right now was captured by a Nest surveillance camera on a November morning in 2015. As you can see, it's early, not much is happening, and everything appears to be very peaceful. However, keep your eye on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Suddenly, the whole camera gets flipped around, but it wasn't knocked over by one of those cats. Instead, you can just make out what appears to be a person's arm in the last couple frames before the feed cuts out completely. Not only was this done deliberately, the reason why would become incredibly important. You see, just a couple of hours after this was recorded, police would find themselves walking into an absolutely horrifying crime scene. Now, that crime scene was at a different house, but it wasn't until investigators saw this footage that they finally started to understand what was really going on here. It's a good thing, too, because as we'll see, it would have been all too easy for this investigation to go in the complete wrong direction. The context behind this creepy video, how these two houses were connected, and more importantly, what police found at that crime scene are what today's case is about. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In the lead up to the holiday season of 2015, 28-year-old Amanda Blackburn knew that she had a lot to be grateful for. She was happily married, she was the mother of a 1-year-old son who she absolutely adored, and she had a huge circle of family and friends. And on top of all of that, she felt like she had very much found her purpose in life. Amanda and her husband, Davey Blackburn, were both devout Christians. Davey was actually a pastor, and for about the last 3 years, he and Amanda had been living in Indianapolis, Indiana, where they'd been working on building up their own ministry. This ministry was called Resonate Church, and it was something Amanda and Davey were both extremely passionate about. It was by no means a large church. They didn't have their own building or anything like that. Instead, they held services every week inside a local middle school. Even so, over this relatively short span of time, they had managed to create quite a dedicated congregation, one that was very active and was only continuing to grow. Now, you might be asking yourself, who just goes and starts a church? That's not your typical path for a couple of 20-something-year-olds, right? Well, for Davey and Amanda, they felt it was something that they had been called to do. Both of them were big believers that if they trusted in their faith, it would lead them in the right direction. And this was something they had been living by since before they even knew each other. Amanda and Davey were introduced when they were both in college, and they kind of met by chance. At the time, Davey was living in South Carolina, but his roommate happened to start dating Amanda's sister, Amber. They arranged to go to a concert together, and from the beginning, the relationship just felt right. Actually, you know what? You don't have to take my word for it. Here are Davey and Amanda describing their story themselves during a special service at their church.
And so that was the end of freshman year, and I remember at the end of freshman year going on this trip to Myrtle Beach with Gavin. We went shopping. That's probably the last time I went shopping as a dude, just to be honest with you, but went shopping, picked out a pair of shirts that matched because we said we will never be on a date, right, where we're going to have to worry about this we're going to have to worry about wearing the same thing, because he had just started dating Amanda's sister before I met Amanda. Then he comes back that summer and goes, dude, I didn't even know what I was thinking, but you need to meet my girlfriend's sister. And so we did. So go ahead and take it away.
This is probably what's going to happen every time I try to talk.
Keep in mind that we had just purchased like 3 or 4 of the same shirts, okay? Because we were never going to see each other on dates. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so that's going to happen, and it's probably going to be about details that don't really matter to the story, but
they're
okay.
Fun.
They're fun. So we were set up on a blind date. We went to a Hawk Nelson concert, and it was really fun. We pretty much clicked right away, and he was on fall break, so he was in town that whole week. So we hung out that whole week, and then said goodbye at the end.
That night, though, we did a milkshake drinking contest, and you shot milkshake out of your nose, and that's when I knew that I'd met the girl that I was going to marry. I knew it right there. She was like, right, all.
I love that clip because I feel like you really get a sense of Amanda and Davey's dynamic. Davy is kind of energetic and all over the place. And while Amanda isn't exactly quiet, you can kind of tell that she's the more grounded, sort of measured one in the relationship. According to loved ones, this is the way that Amanda had been from the time that she was a girl. Though she was the youngest in her family, she wasn't your typical youngest child. From an early age, she was independent, responsible, and thoughtful. She was known as someone who really listened to people and who had this way of just making you feel seen when you were talking to her. These personality traits are part of what later made Amanda perfect for her role at the church. She'd gotten very involved in the women's ministry, and she really helped to build this community of women within the congregation. Anyway, Amanda and Davy got married in the summer of 2008. It was actually a double wedding with Amanda's sister Amber and Davy's roommate Gavin, the one that he mentioned in that clip. And in the years since, things had seemingly only gotten better for the couple. After relocating to Indianapolis, Davy and Amanda had started Resonate Church, they'd had their son, Weston, who was now a year old, and they were really beginning to put down lasting roots. But that holiday season was exciting for another reason. You see, in just a few months' time, the Blackburns will be welcoming a new member into their family. They had just announced that Amanda was 13 weeks pregnant with a little girl. She and Davy already had a name picked out and everything. They were going to call her Everett, or Evie for short. So yeah, at this point, from Amanda's perspective, there wasn't really much more she could ask for out of life. Her family was happy and healthy, she felt fulfilled in what she was doing, and the future looked even brighter. Sadly though, it was then, right in this run-up to what was supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year, that things would come crashing down in the most horrifying way imaginable. Hey there. It's your friend Nigel from the future again, here with another little bonus storytime session for you. So, a few years ago, I was going about my business one day when something pretty scary happened to me. I was reaching for something in my pocket and I sort of accidentally ended up touching my side when I realized that I could feel something there. There was a lump on the right side of my abdomen just a little bit above my waist. Now, you may know that in the past I've talked about the fact that I can overreact a bit when it comes to potential problems with my health. So yeah, finding a strange growth on the side of my body that had never been there before, that sent me into a bit of a tailspin. So you're probably wondering, if I was so anxious about this, what did I do? Well, nothing. Absolutely nothing. For like a long time, actually. I wish I could say I had a good excuse, but the truth is, a big part of the reason I ignored the situation was because I didn't want to go through the hassle of booking an appointment with my doctor. I know, that's a really terrible reason not to take care of myself. But something that I think really would have helped is the sponsor of today's video, ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. And ZocDoc isn't just for one type of care. They have more than 100,000 providers across nearly every specialty, from primary care to dental care, eye care to urgent care to mental health and more. It's the one-stop shop for all your healthcare needs. Plus, it's completely free to use. When you found the doctor you need, you can see their actual appointment openings, choose a time that works for you, and instantly book a visit with just a few clicks. Plus, ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score same-day appointments. No need to call doctor's offices and wait on hold either. ZocDoc lets you do everything online. Going back to my whole situation, in the end, everything was fine. Turns out I just had a lipoma, basically a benign little tumor made out of fat cells. But I was still mad at myself because I knew I'd made a dumb decision. I mean, if this really had been something serious, avoiding it could have had really terrible consequences. So if you're ready to stop being like me and start being proactive about your health, head on over to ZocDoc.com/crimezone. You can also check out the link in the description below. That's ZocDoc.com/crimezone to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today.
911, what's the case emergency?
Yes, I'm at. My wife has collapsed. She is.
Okay, hold on. Stay on for line for EMS. I'll transfer you.
Fire and ambulance. What's the address of your emergency?
2812.
Is that a house or an apartment?
It is a house.
And what's wrong there?
My wife, I just walked in the door coming back from the gym. She's collapsed. She's breathing right now, but there's blood all over the place coming out of her nose, it looks like. She's still breathing. I didn't want to turn her over.
The 911 call that you just listened to was placed shortly after 8 a.m. on November 10th, 2015. It was made by Davy Blackburn, who said that he had just walked into a terrifying situation inside his home. After coming back from the gym that morning, he'd found his wife Amanda covered in blood on the living room floor. She was lying face down next to their Christmas tree, and she wasn't moving. And while it appeared she was still breathing, she also wasn't responding to anything he was saying. As you heard, Davy described Amanda as having collapsed, and he proceeded to tell dispatchers that he thought he knew what might have happened. Amanda had been experiencing dizzy spells during her pregnancy, and there was also a ladder not far from where she was lying. He wondered if she had been putting up Christmas decorations when she'd lost her balance and suffered a serious fall. Thankfully, Davy and Amanda's young son Weston was completely fine. He was in the crib in his bedroom, and he was crying, but otherwise he appeared totally normal. Unfortunately, though, the same thing could not be said for Amanda. When emergency responders arrived, they quickly realized that what had happened to her was not some accident. Amanda was not bleeding from a fall. She was bleeding because she'd been shot. Closer inspection would eventually reveal that Amanda had 3 separate bullet wounds. One was to her left arm, one was to her upper back, and the final one was to the back of her head. In other words, Amanda Blackburn had been the victim of a vicious attack. As paramedics rushed Amanda to the hospital and police got their first real look at the Blackburn home, it only became more clear that this was a crime scene. In fact, almost nothing, aside from that ladder on the floor, lined up with the idea of this being an accident. To begin with, the living room was a mess. There were things randomly out and thrown around all over the place, and it was pretty obvious there had been a struggle here. Among these items was Amanda's wallet, the contents of which were scattered on the floor. After realizing Amanda had been shot, police were also able to recover one of the bullets. It was a .38 caliber round, which was found lodged in one of the trim boards around a set of stairs. By far the most glaring and disturbing evidence, though, was right next to where Amanda had been lying. It was a pair of her underwear. Amanda wasn't wearing any when she was found, and her shirt was actually partially pulled up when emergency responders arrived at the scene. So, yeah, these observations combined, what they suggested was pretty chilling. Putting all of this together, the situation appeared to have all of the elements of a violent home invasion. The house had been ransacked, Amanda's purse and wallet had been gone through, and Amanda herself had been shot and possibly sexually assaulted. However, as I kind of hinted at a second ago, already there was something that was nagging at police. What they were seeing, very little of it matched what Davy described in his 911 call. And that begged the question, how could he have walked into this and thought that what had happened to his wife was an accident? Well, detectives knew there was one possible explanation, and it wasn't a good one. And their suspicions were only about to grow stronger as they started taking a second look at some of the details at the crime scene. After Amanda arrived at the hospital barely clinging to life, doctors did everything they could for her. She was temporarily stabilized and placed on a ventilator, allowing her family and friends to gather around her bedside. While everyone was hoping and praying for a miracle, sadly, the damage done by the brutal attack was just too severe. The following day, Amanda passed away in her hospital bed. Her unborn child also did not survive. The one small comfort was that Amanda's loved ones were able to be with her until the end. Obviously, this was a heartbreaking update, but it also had serious implications for police. This was no longer just a possible home invasion robbery and a shooting, it was now a murder case. Speaking of robbery, as I said before, at first glance, this appeared to be where the evidence in the investigation was pointing. It also made sense because there had been some burglaries in the area recently, so it was easy to see how this might have been an attempted one that went wrong. However, at the same time, back at the crime scene, detectives were starting to uncover other details. And some of those details were beginning to make them question whether there might be something else going on here. For starters, despite how chaotic the living room was, it was really the only room in the Blackburn home that looked like this. Nothing in any other area of the residence had seemingly been touched, even though there were valuables in other parts of the house. In fact, when detectives took a closer look at the evidence, even in the living room, it wasn't clear that anything had actually been taken. Yes, things were thrown around, and Amanda's wallet had been dumped out on the floor, but they couldn't say for sure that anything was missing. One of the biggest red flags, though, was the total lack of forced entry. It made authorities wonder, was this actually a home invasion, or was it just staged to look like one? And if it was staged, who would do something like this? Well, that's when things got even stranger. When detectives began speaking with Davey and getting a more detailed account of what he was doing that morning, he told them that it wouldn't have been necessary for an intruder to break anything to gain access to the house. That's because when he went to the gym that morning, he left the front door unlocked. Davey explained that he did this because at the time, the family only had one house key, and it was on Amanda's keyring. But to investigators, this was unusual, especially because, remember, there had been other burglaries in the area recently, and Davey would have known this. So the idea that he would have left his pregnant wife and young son in an unlocked house early in the morning, it raised some eyebrows. And that only continued as Davey laid out the rest of his morning. Davey stated that he'd left the house around 6 o'clock and he'd gone to a local LA Fitness a short drive away. He estimated he was there for just under an hour, and that when he finished his workout, it was a little after 7 a.m. He stated that afterwards he headed straight home, getting there sometime around 7:30. You might remember, though, that Davey didn't actually call 911 until after 8. So what was he doing for the roughly 40 minutes between when he arrived back at the house and when he called for help? Well, according to Davey, he was sitting in his car in the driveway. He said that he'd called one of his pastor friends in Delaware and that they'd been chatting that entire time. When asked why he did this rather than making the call in the house, Davey said that he and Amanda had an agreement about his early morning workouts. Basically, he was supposed to avoid making noise until Weston was awake. He told police that it was only once he finally entered the house that he became aware that something was wrong. As for why Davey initially thought what had happened was an accident, he said he didn't really know. He claimed that he did start looking around and eventually realized that there were things that didn't make sense, but this was only after he made the 911 call. Before that, he was just overcome with the shock of seeing Amanda on the floor. So, Davey had explanations for most of the things that had caught the attention of detectives, but at the same time, it all sounded a little convenient. He leaves his door unlocked and his house just happens to get broken into. And then to top it all off, during this crucial window of time, as Amanda desperately needs help, he's sitting there feet away in his car. And that's not even to mention the inconsistencies at the actual crime scene. Needless to say, detectives were suspicious, and they weren't the only ones. When Amanda's funeral was held 5 days later, the turnout was massive. More than 2,000 people attended the service, which was held at the Traders Point Christian Church in Whitestown. While the occasion was definitely devastating, loved ones tried their best to strike a balance with the event. Yes, it was important to reflect on the awful tragedy of the loss of Amanda and her unborn daughter, but they also felt it was important to celebrate Amanda's life and to recognize the impact she'd made on so many of those around her. Just a side note here, one of the things that we came across in our research that really stuck with me was a comparison that we heard brought up multiple times by Amanda's loved ones. It was how Amanda's way with people was very similar to one of her favorite hobbies, which was restoring old furniture. Amanda loved going to vintage markets and finding these pieces with potential that not everyone could see. And that's kind of the way that Amanda made people feel when they were with her. She could see all of these amazing qualities in others that sometimes they couldn't even see in themselves. She was always willing to invest her time in people, and she did so in a genuine way that made them feel special. Even as the community gathered to celebrate Amanda, though, and support her grieving loved ones, rumors were starting to spread online. Rumors that her own husband, Davey, might have been involved in her murder. Now, most of this did not come from people that knew Amanda and Davey. The vast majority of it was from total strangers online. But nonetheless, the speculation was rampant. People wondered about life insurance policies, whether there was abuse in the relationship, and they questioned whether the couple were really as happy as they seemed. People also began digging through anything they could find related to the Blackburns' church, looking for stuff that they thought might be connected to the case. One clip in particular quickly began circulating. It was taken from a sermon Davy had given just 2 days before the crime. And it involved him shooting an airsoft gun at one of his congregation members.
To sing, it became a weapon. Don't worry, this is an airsoft gun. A weapon to battle worry. I thought we'd just have some fun with it. Come here, Zach, come on. Because sometimes you just need to be reminded. Dare, come hold my microphone. You just need to be reminded that when you get that phone call, instead of worrying about it, step over here, because I'm going to go crossways. Instead of worrying about it, maybe you need to worship. Boom. Instead of worrying about the medical bill, maybe you need to worship. Instead of, I missed right there, but it's okay if your worship misses. Just go again. Maybe instead of worrying so much about your kids, you need to lift it up and surrender it to Jesus in worship. Maybe instead of worrying about the job situation, you need to worship. Maybe instead of worrying about the project at school, you need to study and then worship. Maybe instead of worrying about what other people think about you, you need to worship. Come on!
I should say that out of context, this looks quite a bit more unhinged than it actually is. Again, the gun wasn't real, and it was supposed to be a metaphor for how worship can be used as a weapon to combat the things that people worry about in life. But understandably, in hindsight, it didn't look great, especially given the timing. However, just as all of these rumors were really picking up steam online, behind the scenes of the actual investigation, things were going in the complete opposite direction. You see, by this time, authorities had thoroughly investigated Davy Blackburn's alibi, and all of it checked out. Not only were detectives able to obtain surveillance video from the LA Fitness showing that Davy was there when he said he was, his cell phone records and location data lined up with the information he provided as well. Even the call from the driveway, it had happened exactly the way Davy described. What really interested police, though, was when they began canvassing the neighborhood, and they spoke to witnesses who said that they'd heard gunshots on the morning of Amanda's murder. Those witnesses told police the shots happened between 6:40 and 6:45, when Davy was still at the gym. Now, you might be saying to yourself, wait, aren't there a couple of other loose ends here? What about that strange stuff at the crime scene? Well, that's where the canvassing would come in handy once again, because it turned out investigators had received some other information and evidence that would completely change the trajectory of the case. During their canvassing efforts, police weren't just speaking to residents in the area. They were also requesting video from any homeowners with surveillance cameras. And when they started combing through footage from the morning of the murder, they quickly found something that stood out. Multiple cameras had captured an unknown man walking down the street not far from the Blackburn home. The man was wearing a hoodie, so it wasn't possible to make out his face, but he immediately caught the attention of detectives. And if you look at the timestamp on the video, you can probably understand why. The unknown man was pacing up and down the road just after 7 a.m., less than half an hour after neighbors claimed they'd heard those gunshots. Multiple people actually remembered seeing this guy themselves. They told detectives he looked agitated. They had never seen him in the neighborhood before, and he was having a heated conversation with someone on a cell phone. As investigators continued watching, they saw that the man was picked up, getting into the passenger seat of a light-colored sedan, which promptly left the area. Again, police weren't able to 100% determine the make of the car or who was driving, but a camera capturing it from a second angle made them suspect it was a silver Chrysler Sebring. So what did this mean? Well, on its own, not a lot, other than the fact that authorities now had another potential person of interest. That was, until they received another tip. And that brings us back to that other piece of footage that I showed you at the very beginning of this video. I told you before that this footage was captured by a Nest surveillance camera, and that the recording abruptly cut out. Well, the reason for that was that this house had just been broken into. and the people responsible had purposely disabled it. I've already mentioned a couple of times that there had been burglaries in the area prior to Amanda's murder, but this was not just any burglary. It happened at a home belonging to a woman named Allison Becker, and Allison Becker was a neighbor of Amanda and Davy Blackburn. Not only did Allison live just 3 houses down from the Blackburn family, this footage, it was captured on the morning of Amanda's murder. In fact, it was recorded at 5:30 a.m., just half an hour before Davy left for the gym. After seeing this, detectives felt that they finally understood what had happened. Their original theory of the case was pretty much correct, with one major and tragic exception. Amanda Blackburn was not originally supposed to be the victim of a crime that morning. Allow me to explain. So the break-in at Allison's place happened first, around 5:30, and it was fairly straightforward. Evidence found at the scene suggested multiple people had forced their way in through her back porch. Once inside, they'd stolen a number of items. Most of these things were what you'd expect: computers, jewelry, a TV, stuff like that. But there were also a couple of unusual items taken. This included a bag of oranges and a pink sweater. Anyway, Allison worked nights, so she was not home at the time. This is also why when authorities originally responded to Davy's 911 call, they didn't know anything about this other crime. But obviously, a second break-in in the same neighborhood during the exact same window of time, this was not a coincidence. Detectives were certain that these crimes were linked, and that moreover, the attack at the Blackburn home likely was not part of the original plan for the perpetrators. Instead, police suspected that whoever was responsible had likely seen Davy leaving for the gym while they were robbing Allison's house, and believing that it was also empty, they had decided to go there next. As for the unknown man in that other surveillance video in the car that had picked him up, detectives didn't think this was a coincidence either. They now believed that these were the people they were actually looking for. In other words, Davy Blackburn was completely innocent. All of those things that police thought were strange before, him telling them that he thought what had happened was an accident, his phone call during that crucial window of time on the driveway, those were the real coincidences. You know, that plus shock. So yeah, Davy truly had nothing to do with Amanda's murder. Again though, you might be wondering, what about the fact that nothing was actually stolen from the Blackburn home? Well, police discovered they were wrong about that. One of the cards from Amanda's wallet actually was missing. It's just that they weren't aware of this until they were notified about suspicious activity on Amanda's bank account. Detectives learned that one of Amanda's debit cards had been used at 2 separate Chase Bank ATMs on the morning of the murder, and both of these transactions had taken place during that same window of time that they had been investigating. The first transaction was a failed withdrawal for $500 at a drive-through ATM just off of Michigan Road, and had taken place at 6:36 a.m. The second was a successful withdrawal of $400, which had happened at an ATM a little further north, near 86th Street and Ditch Road. That transaction occurred at 6:46 a.m. So basically, right when neighbors told police they'd heard those gunshots. Unfortunately, when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from these ATMs, they saw that the person who'd made the transactions was smart enough to cover their face. However, there were still clues that could be gleaned from the videos. Police were now able to prove that the vehicle they'd seen in that other surveillance footage definitely was connected to all of this, and it was a silver Chrysler Sebring. They were also able to confirm that multiple suspects were involved in the crime. This was a crew of burglars that were working together. Detectives theorized that after breaking into the Blackburn home, attacking Amanda, and stealing her debit card, the suspects had split up. That unknown man pacing up and down the road, he was the one who had stayed behind to make sure they had the proper PIN number to steal Amanda's money. Chillingly, it seemed that once the robbers got what they wanted, they had killed her. If there was any remaining doubt that this theory was correct, that went away when police did some digging and learned that a silver Chrysler Sebring had been stolen just hours before all of this took place. It had been taken from an apartment belonging to a woman named Jacola Searsbrook. After taking a look at the police report, investigators were convinced that this was where the crime spree began that morning. It had a similar MO to the other 2 burglaries. After breaking in, the suspects had taken a number of valuables, including a cell phone, laptop, headphones, and car keys. However, in this case, there was one additional eerie detail. You see, Jacola was home and asleep during all of this. She didn't even realize she'd been robbed until later that morning, when she woke up and discovered that her car was missing. Jacola also had a surveillance camera in her home, which is how authorities obtained these incredibly creepy images, which were captured during the burglary. And while once again, these were not detailed enough to make an identification, police now knew for certain there were 3 suspects involved in the crime spree. At this point, this was actually kind of frustrating for detectives. I mean, these guys had been caught on camera so many times, but all of the footage was low quality and grainy. But they did have one solid lead now, the stolen car, and it would prove to be extremely important. After putting out a citywide alert, the silver Chrysler was found abandoned near 38th Street and Brookwood Drive, and it was an absolute treasure trove of evidence. The vehicle was filled with items, further connecting it to all 3 crime scenes. Things like remotes from stolen TVs, one of the Chase Bank receipts from the failed withdrawal with Amanda's debit card, even the bag of oranges and the pink sweater that were taken from Allison Becker's house. All of this was useful, but strangely, out of everything, it was that pink sweater that would become the single most valuable piece of evidence. You may have noticed before that in that first bit of bank surveillance footage, the pink sweater was wrapped around one of the suspects' faces. Well, while this may have helped to conceal his identity, leaving it behind was a big mistake, because it turned out he'd slobbered all over it. And when authorities sent the piece of clothing off for analysis, not only were they able to extract a DNA profile, that profile came back as a match to an offender who was already in the system. His name was Jalen Watson, a 21-year-old convicted felon and known burglar. Upon receiving this information, detectives were able to use it to obtain Jalen's phone records. And let's just say, they were quite damning. Location data placed him at all of the crime scenes on the morning of November 10th. And his phone was actively being used during that second ATM withdrawal with Amanda Blackburn's debit card. When investigators looked at Jalen's call log that morning, it was very clear who he'd been with. He'd been communicating with another 21-year-old man named Deano Gordon and an 18-year-old man named Larry Joe Taylor Jr. Both of these men also had extensive criminal records, and a further search of their cell phone data showed that it was Larry who had stayed behind, while Jalen and Deano went to the 2 separate ATMs. Following these discoveries, all 3 of the men were arrested and brought in for questioning. And while initially none of them would talk, eventually that changed. Deano Gordon was the first one to flip, and what he told detectives was gut-wrenching. Deano admitted that in the early hours of November 10th, 2015, he, Jalen, and Larry had been hanging out when they decided to commit some burglaries. They started by walking to Jacola Searsbrook's apartment because it was close by, but had expanded their search for vulnerable properties after stealing Jacola's car. Upon driving around for a bit after the first burglary, they'd come across Allison Becker's house, which had a back porch that looked like it would be easy to break into. Sure enough, it was. And once inside, they began taking everything they could of value and loading it into the stolen Chrysler. While they were doing this, though, Larry happened to notice someone leaving another property just a few houses down. He said that the place was probably empty, and when they went to check, it seemed like they were in luck because the front door had been left unlocked. This, of course, was Amanda and Davy Blackburn's house. Deano claimed that he had nothing to do with this third burglary. He stated that he waited in the car while Jalen and Larry went inside, and that a short time later, Jalen had run back out with Amanda's debit card. It was only then, he said, that he learned that the house was not actually empty. Even so, just as detectives had suspected, Deano said he had agreed to help Jalen steal money using the card, and that Larry had stayed behind to make sure Amanda gave them the correct PIN number. However, he insisted no one was supposed to get hurt. He said that after they successfully withdrew cash from that second ATM, they were preparing to go back and get Larry, when suddenly he called them first. Deano told investigators that Larry now sounded incredibly panicked and angrily demanded that they come and pick him up right away. He kept calling over and over again, even after they said that they were already on the way. and when they got back to the neighborhood, they discovered that Larry had left the house and was walking down the street. When Larry got into the car, he was clearly nervous, and he said that they needed to drop him off somewhere. They did, though not before Larry started giving Deano and Jalen sickening details about what he had done while they were at the bank. According to Deano, Larry said that after Amanda gave up her PIN number, he'd forced himself on her. Though she resisted and attempted to fight back, he brutally violated her before shooting her multiple times. If that wasn't horrifying enough, Larry explained he'd stood over Amanda and watched her bleed out before leaving the house. Deano said that despite his frantic demeanor, it seemed like Larry was almost proud of what he had done. The detectives felt that Deano's whole narrative was fairly self-serving in the sense that he was obviously trying to minimize his own involvement in the crime. His version of events did match up with key details of the case, and following his confession, Jalen Watson soon gave a similar story that backed this up. That being said, authorities did not believe that the men didn't think anyone was going to get hurt. At the very least, they felt that they should have known that something like this was coming. And that's because both Deano and Jalen admitted that Larry had been acting like a complete psycho well before they ever went into Amanda's home. It was Larry who had insisted on bringing a gun during the crime spree in the first place, and he'd very nearly killed Jacola Searsbrook during that initial burglary. After discovering she was asleep in bed, Deano and Jalen said that Larry had gone into her room and was saying that he needed to shoot her because he was afraid of being identified. Even after that close call, though, Deano and Jalen had still agreed to rob 2 more houses with Larry, and they'd agreed to leave him alone with Amanda. So yeah, no one was buying that this was some sort of unforeseeable circumstance. Still, because of their cooperation, Deano Gordon and Jalen Watson were treated differently than Larry Taylor. Though they were initially charged with a number of different offenses, both eventually took plea deals. Both pleaded guilty to 1 count of robbery resulting in serious bodily injury, as well as 2 counts of burglary, with Jalen receiving 29 years and Deano receiving 30. It's unclear exactly why Deano got the heavier sentence, considering he was both the first to cooperate and, as far as we can tell, the only one of the 3 to really attempt to make a serious apology to Amanda's loved ones. What's even more confusing is that an additional chunk of Jalen's sentence was also later suspended. In the end, though, I suppose it doesn't really matter. What's more important is that Deano and Jalen's cooperation helped to make sure Larry Taylor was never going to be a free man ever again. This was important because Larry refused to accept any responsibility for his actions and instead opted to take his chances at trial. The proceedings ended up dragging out for nearly 7 years, though in September of 2022, he was finally convicted of murder, burglary, and a number of other offenses following a bench trial. He was sentenced to 86 years in prison. At the sentencing, several of Amanda's loved ones spoke, including Davy. They talked about the immense pain of losing her and her unborn child, but they also discussed redemption and their personal decisions to eventually forgive all 3 of the men who were responsible for Amanda's murder. Davy has been particularly outspoken about his grief in the years since, and while he has admitted that he was overcome with rage and hatred at the time of the tragedy, it appears he ultimately found comfort in his faith. In a recent interview we came across during our research, though, he also spoke about the more pragmatic side of this as well, saying that this kind of pain can take you in 2 directions. Either it grows and festers, turning into something that eventually destroys you, or you can do something with it to bring meaning to an otherwise senseless situation. From the looks of it, Davy has definitely done the latter. Not only did he start a new ministry centered around his journey through grief and forgiveness, called Nothing is Wasted, he was also able to find love again. In 2018, he remarried a woman named Christy Monroy, who was also a single parent. By all indications, the pair are still happily married and have since had another child together. At the time of this recording, Larry Taylor, Deano Gordon, and Jalen Watson all remain incarcerated. Even though we've now covered everything officially related to this case, I feel like we can't truly wrap up this video until we talk about one other thing. You see, during our research for this story, it became very clear that there was still a sizable community of people out there who are convinced Davy Blackburn was responsible for Amanda's murder. Most of the reasons for this we've already covered, though there are others that I only briefly touched on before. And that's because basically all of these amount to little more than rumors and speculation, or are based on details that we were not able to confirm. In terms of things that are variations on topics we've already talked about, these are claims like Davy left the house later and did a shorter workout than usual on the morning of the murder, which some have concluded meant that he was trying to get home at a specific time that day. Basically, the suggestion is that he knew the crime was going to happen and that he was waiting until it was done, which is also why he made that call to his friend in the driveway. Personally, I feel like this is pretty easy to dismiss, though. This supposedly shorter workout was shorter by like 15 minutes. And in terms of the timing, people don't always go to the gym at the exact same time. Shocking, I know. However, other claims are worth discussing. Probably the one we've seen come up the most often is the fact that Davy had a life insurance policy on Amanda, one that was supposedly taken out just 2 months before her murder, and which only took effect right before the crime. This is a claim we saw repeated over and over again. However, we weren't able to find any credible sources that actually confirmed this. Assuming it is true, it's definitely interesting, and hopefully it's something police looked into, but at the same time, occasionally freak coincidences happen. I mean, in some ways, this whole case was one of those. Amanda was never supposed to even be targeted in the first place. The fact that her house was broken into only happened because, by complete chance, Allison Becker's home was burglarized right before Davy went to the gym. That brings me to the main reason I don't think the Davy theories add up, and that's the fact that in the 7 years it took for Larry Taylor to go to trial, neither his defense team nor the defenses for Deano or Jalen attempted to show any connection between them and Davy. If Davy really was a part of this, where's the evidence of them communicating? Let me remind you that it took all of 3 seconds for authorities to connect Jalen to Deano and Larry after they started going through his phone records. These guys were not master criminals. I mean, they left behind a car full of evidence, for God's sakes. Also, when push came to shove, Deano and Jalen flipped on each other and Larry. So if Davy had set this up or paid them or something, why wouldn't they have thrown him under the bus as well? I mean, presumably prosecutors would have needed them even more if they had this kind of information, and they could have potentially gotten a hell of a deal in exchange for their cooperation. So are we supposed to believe that they were just incredibly loyal for no good reason? Finally, in my opinion, the MO of the whole crime spree doesn't make sense for this being some kind of setup. If the sole purpose of all of this was to kill Amanda, why would Larry, Deano, and Jalen have committed 2 other burglaries before this third break-in? Not only were they risking getting caught, it wasn't even possible for them to get to the second and third crime scenes until they broke into Jacola Searsbrook's apartment and stole her car. That seems pretty on the fly for a predetermined, calculated plan. Even so, it appears that there are a few particularly dedicated people out there who have invested a considerable amount of time in stirring up speculation surrounding this case and accusing Davy Blackburn of murder. A huge part of this seems to revolve around putting every aspect of his life under a microscope, including his new marriage. Now, it is true that Davy met and started dating Christy relatively quickly after all of this happened, less than a year after Amanda's death, and this has led to all sorts of rumors online, such as that he wasn't really in mourning, or that maybe he had been seeing Christy before the murder. However, much like the rest of these claims, there's just no evidence. In fact, what we do know points in the opposite direction. In his blog, in interviews, and in many other places, Davy has talked and written extensively about how he was also worried about rushing into something new, and that he'd never planned to put himself back out there until enough time had passed. However, after coming across Christy by chance and starting to talk to her, he learned that not only did they have a lot in common, her stepfather happened to be a local prison chaplain who regularly spoke to the 3 men responsible for Amanda's murder. Seeing this as a sign, Davy and Christy decided to pursue their relationship. Overall, I think this whole thing illustrates one of the more heartbreaking aspects of cases like this, and that's that for loved ones, the tragedy is never truly over. Not only does the loss and grief never go away, but in situations like this, how do you move on and start a new chapter of your life when you've got all these people still harassing you and accusing you of murder, even more than a decade later? Thankfully, it seems that both Davy and Amanda's family are doing well, and they continue to remember her for the way that she lived, not the way that she died. Because of that, I think it's only fitting that I leave you with some of Davy's words about Amanda, which came from an interview last year. Quote, Amanda was probably the most selfless person you have ever met in your entire life. She made her life about other people, and that's why people were so impacted by her. I think that is one of the most amazing attributes about Amanda, is that she lived her life for something bigger than herself, and she wanted her life to be poured out to help other people. She was like an equalizer for our entire family. If anything ever got kind of out of balance emotionally or whatever, she was the stabilizer for everybody. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.